As you all has mentioned, my interest is on labor economics, but I do concentrate on Indonesia as a country because I'm also interested in development, and I think Indonesia is a very interesting case when you want to study development economics. So I work on labor issues, I've worked on gender issues, I've also worked on the role of self-employment in the labor market. So this project I'm presenting today is on the role of self-employment during the Asian financial crisis. So basically, when we look at labor response to the Asian financial crisis in Indonesia, I found that there are two kind of stylized facts. The first one is there is an increase in total employment. So unlike in many other countries, when there's a big shock, employment decreases. In Indonesia, actually, employment has increased. So I think it's a very interesting fact. Also, at the same time, there's a shift of employment from the wage sector into the self-employed sector. So it seems like self-employed sector in Indonesia during the crisis played a very interesting role. It was able to absorb labor laid off from the wage sector. Also, at the same time, it was able to absorb labor supplied additionally by households during the crisis. So the main question for this project, for this paper, is did having self-employed business function as an insurance for households during the Asian financial crisis? So in another word, I treat the ownership of a self-employed business by households as an endowment right before the crisis, and I see whether if you have this endowment, would having a self-employed business help households during the crisis? So in terms of household welfare during the crisis, I look at consumption and also labor supply. So there's a decrease in consumption during the crisis for an average household. There's also increase in labor supply for average household. So I want to see if they had self-employed business before the crisis, would they have a smaller increase in consumption or a smaller decrease? A smaller decrease in consumption and smaller increase in labor supply. So that's the main question. If you have any questions during, just feel free to ask. Don't have to wait until the end. So before I go any further, I think because the definition of informal sector of self-employment is kind of vague in the development literature, so I want to state my definition. So I define self-employed sector as small household businesses. So if the household has a small businesses, it's in the self-employed sector. And at the individual level, people who are employed in the self-employed sector are people who report themselves to be either self-employed or unpaid family workers. So I'll have a preview of results in case you fall asleep later. So basically, I've tested the magnitude of the insurance value of household business or self-employed business during the crisis. The methodology I use is difference in difference. I'll elaborate on that later. The main results I found is if households had self-employed business before the crisis, there's no effect on household consumption, but there is a significant effect on household labor supply. So if they had self-employment before the crisis, they would increase labor supply by a much lesser amount. So the effect of self-employment on labor supply is negative and significant. So I think this results give some evidence for an insurance value of self-employment. So basically it means that if they have it before the crisis, they could increase labor supply by a lesser amount to maintain the same level of consumption during the crisis. And having these results, I think we can deepen our understanding on self-employed sector in developing countries. So why do I want to ask this question? Why is it important? I think there are several reasons. First of all, it's the first step to analyze a potential risk management strategy in developing countries. So my story is there's shock to the self-employed sector, there's also shock to the wage sector, but if these shocks are not perfectly correlated, then having some employment in the self-employed sector at the same time, having self-employment in the wage sector would function as a risk managing strategy at a household level. So they can have members who work in both sectors. If anything happening in either sector, the other sector will function as insurance. Also, doing this, asking this question, I think it will help our understanding of the self-employed sector in urban areas. So I'll concentrate on urban Indonesia, and in many, not only Indonesia, but in many developing countries, there's a very large self-employed sector in urban areas. But to my understanding, there's not much study, so we don't really have much understanding of this sector. We have more understanding of the wage modern sector, but not on self-employed sector. So analyzing its insurance role will be an interesting angle, I think, to look at the self-employed sector. Also, in developing countries, self-employed sector is highly correlated with the informal sector. So there's a big policy debate on the informal sector. So my analysis adds to this debate. So what's the policy debate? I think there are two general views on the informal sector in developing countries. The more traditional one is a more negative view. They think it's a backward sector with low productivity, and it's less efficient than the modern wage sector. Also, it has limited potential for growth and development. But also, recently there's a more positive view. They still think the informal sector is an engine for employment generation. So my analysis has a third explanation, which is insurance angle. So actually, the informal sector may be used as insurance against shocks in the wage or modern sector. And then if policies do intend to improve job security or improve volatility in the modern sector or wage sector, such as unemployment insurance, then maybe households would have a less incentive to use the informal sector as an insurance because they have a more institutional, formal insurance. And then this will potentially reduce the size of the self-employed sector or the informal sector automatically. So that's some policy implication. In terms of the economic literature, this project will add two strands. First, the strand of literature on the informal sector. So it's kind of similar to the argument before. In the economics literature, there used to be two explanations for why there's a big informal sector in developing countries and why there's a earning gap between the formal and informal sector. And so one strand is by Harrison Tonero, a famous paper. So they think because formal sector has this entry barrier and people cannot be employed in the formal sector will be rationed out of the formal sector and pushed into the informal sector. Another more recent literature views the informal sector as a voluntary choice. So the people who are employed in the informal sector may actually choose to work in that sector because maybe they can earn a higher earning in the informal sector than they would in the formal sector. So this paper adds a third explanation. So maybe at a household level, they want to have some employment in the informal sector at the same time as the wage sector to have this kind of insurance against shocks in the formal sector. This paper will also add to the literature on risk and insurance. So in the development literature, there is this strategy of diversification of income as a risk managing strategy reviewed by people. So most of this literature is on rural areas. So people have looked at the diversification between farm and non-farm activities in rural areas. They have also looked at the diversification in terms of location of land plots or types of crops grown. So this is a risk managing strategy, assuming that the shocks to farm or non-farm activities are not correlated, or assuming the shocks to different land plots or to different kinds of plots are not correlated, then having strategy on the same line, but in an urban area. So I look at diversification between wage employment and self-employment used by urban households. So before going to the empirical analysis, actually I want to talk a little bit about the model. So I will give you a sense of how I am thinking about the household decision, what's the setting, and how households make choices on labor and consumption. So there's a formal model in the paper, but I'm not writing equations here. So basically the model means that households maximize discounted lifetime utility by allocating labor and consumption in each period. So in the lifetime of a household, there are a lot of periods. And utility depends on consumption as well as on leisure. So it depends on how much you consume, but also depends on how much you work. If you work less, you get more utility. Also, households allocate adult members in the household into different employment status. They can have members to work in the wage employment sector. They can have members to work in the self-employed sector. They can also allocate people to be not working. And also the returns to wage employment and self-employment are not perfectly, they're subject to shocks, but the shocks to these two sectors are not perfectly correlated. And another important feature of the model is that there's an entry cost into self-employment. So based on this model, it implies that households will have an incentive to diversify. And actually I found this is kind of evidence how much they diversify. So in urban areas, I used a Family Life survey. So in urban households, about 50% only have wage employment. About 26% only have self-employment. But there's a big percentage, 24% of households actually have employment in both sectors. So these are more like the diversified households. So this is kind of preliminary evidence that households do diversify. And another important prediction of the model is that if the shock to the wage employment sector is big, so if the wage sector is hit harder than the self-employed sector, then due to this entry cost into self-employment, having self-employment before the realization of the shock will help households during the shock. So that's the prediction of the model. And then in the later empirical analysis, I will show that the Asian financial crisis is actually such a shock. So it hits the wage sector harder than the self-employed sector. And also I will estimate the effect of having prior self-employment on household consumption and work during the crisis. So the data I'm using, I use two data sets, but mainly I use the Indonesian Family Life survey. I guess you're all pretty familiar with this data. It's a household panel data that has around 7,000 households. So it has the time are 93, 97, 2000, 2007. So I use 1997 round as the round that's before the crisis, and 2000 as the round that's during the crisis. I agree 2000 is kind of already not the deepest part of the crisis, but I don't have any years before. And then this data, the one good thing about this data is it has income information not only on wage workers, but on self-employed workers. In many other data, there's only income information on wage workers. Another good thing is not only do they have information on work, but they also have information on consumption. So I can look at both at the same time. Also, they have very good information on household businesses. So I can look and see what are household businesses like in Indonesia. The other data I'm using is labor force survey, the synchronous. So what I have is from 86 to 2011. The good thing about this data is it's a long-term data that's annual, so I can look at long-term trends. Also, it has bigger sample size, but only has work information, but not on consumption. So mainly, I'll just use this data as a cross-check from what I get from the other data set. So now I look at some more descriptive things on what are household businesses like in Indonesia, and what is the financial crisis like, what happened during the crisis, what happened to the employment allocation during the crisis, and why is the wage sector hit harder than the self-employed sector. So first, let's take a look at the description of household businesses in Indonesia. So this is from the Family Life Survey. This is actually from 2007 because they have more detailed information. So I guess you would have a better sense of what they're like than me. So from the data, it seems around 50% are operating outside the home, and about 90% don't have any kind of permit. So only 10% have a license. And then in terms of line of business, 30% is in restaurants and food sales, 30% is in non-food sales. So I think they're small stores that sells food or other things. And interesting, around 12% is in hair and hairdressing. Around 40% only has one person, so it's a single person business. And 95% has less than 5 workers, so they're very small. And only 16% has paid employees, so basically it means they are real household businesses that only use household members to work. And then the last week, but I think it's very important description, is in terms of entry cost. So it's the starting capital. They asked the households what's the starting capital for this business. So I calculate this relative to household consumption. So this one means that the median of starting capital for urban household businesses is 1.26 times per capita monthly consumption for that same household. So in terms of median, it's about 1, and in terms of mean, it's actually around 9 times per capita consumption monthly for that household. So depending on what you think, it's a big amount, but I think it still shows that the entry cost or starting capital for these very small businesses is substantial in urban Indonesia. And then I want to talk a little bit about what happened during crisis. Again, you may know more about this. So I think there's a sharp depreciation of the rupiah, and at the same time there was a removal of rice subsidy, and also due to this there's a big increase in food prices, and it led to the increase of other prices. So there was a very high inflation during the crisis. And at the same time, I think in many formal sector firms, there was a huge decrease in productivity. And according to World Bank data, GDP decreased by 15% in 1998 in just 1 year. So it's a pretty big shock. And in terms of labor market response to the crisis, when I use IFLS, and I look at, I'm pointing to this, I should point to this, sorry. When I use the Indonesian Family Life Survey, we can see that from 93 to 97, so that's a non-crisis period, there's not much change in terms of allocation between sectors. But from 97 to 2000, which is the crisis period, the wage employment decreased by around 3%. Self-employment increased by around 8%, and the people who don't work decreased by 4%. So total employment actually increased by 4 percentage points. So I think it's a pretty big reallocation in terms of percentage points. And to have some more confidence in the previous finding, I also used the labor force survey, the SIGMAS, to do the same exercise. So this one shows the trend of wage employment versus self-employment from 86 to 2000. So if we look at the crisis period, we kind of see the same pattern. So from 97 to 98, wage employment decreased by around 2%. Self-employment increased more than 1%, but by 2000, increased more than 2%. So the synchronous also shows the same pattern, which gives me more confidence to say that during the crisis, there's actually a reallocation from the wage sector into the self-employed sector. So this shift kind of indicates that the self-employed sector was more resilient to the crisis, than the wage sector. But why would this be? I think there are several reasons, but if you have more explanations, I'm really interested to hear. So first of all, I think the self-employed sector, because they're very small household businesses, they use less imported inputs, so they're less hit by currency depreciation. Also, this sector doesn't really borrow in the formal financial sector, and because it's a financial crisis, the self-employed sector is more immune to the chaos in the financial sector. Also, the self-employed sector businesses, as I've shown, are small businesses that cater to more everyday needs of people. So they're more, so the demand for these kind of products and services is less elastic to the crisis. But for more luxurious products and services provided by the formal sector, people can actually substitute away from them during big shocks. So then the demand for the self-employed sector would be hit less during big economic shocks. And since I'm suspecting the self-employed sector is hit less, do we see this reflected in income? So using the Indonesian wildlife survey, I look at the change in income in both sectors for different periods. So we can see from 93 to 97, the income in both sectors is increasing, but it's increasing faster in the wage sector. And then during the crisis period, it's decreasing for both sectors and decreased a little bit more for the wage sector. And then after the crisis, it wasn't really increasing for the self-employed sector, but increasing really fast for the wage sector. So I think this table tells that there's a trend of fast increase in the wage sector, but not very fast increase in self-employment. So if we look at this relative to the trend, there's a much bigger deviation from the trend for the wage sector than the self-employed sector, which is kind of indicating that the wage sector is hit more during the crisis. And also, because in the Family Life Survey, they do ask whether you experienced a shock in a particular year. So I can also look at whether if households only have wage employment or if they only have self-employment, would they experience different kinds of shocks during the crisis? So I look at two groups of households. This group only had wage employment. This group only has self-employment. And I want to see whether the percentage of households that experienced a big shock would be different for different periods. So for wage employment, the shock I look at is loss of a job. For self-employment, I look at failure of a business. So we can see in a pre-crisis period, actually the self-employed sector faces more risk in terms of big economic failure. But during the crisis, which is 98-99, actually the wage sector faces more shock. So a much higher percentage of households experience loss of jobs. So I think I've kind of established the fact that there's a reallocation from wage sector into the self-employed sector during the crisis, and also it seems like the wage sector was hit more than the self-employed sector during the crisis. So the main empirical estimation I want to do in this paper is to estimate the effect of having self-employed business before the crisis on household consumption and labor during the crisis. So before showing my estimation equation, I want to talk a little bit about decision timing. So it's part of the model. So this is one period. At the beginning of the period, the household would be having this state variables, which is they would have an amount of asset, and then it would have whether they have self-employed business or not. So it's an indicator variable. And then at the beginning of the period, the shocks will be realized. So the shocks to the returns in both sectors will be realized. Also, there may be some change in household composition and characteristics. And then based on what they have at the beginning of the period and based on the realization of the shocks, the household will choose consumption labor for this period. And after they choose their allocations, they will arrive at a new state variable. So they arrive at a new amount of asset and arrive at a new indicator whether they have self-employed business or not. So if they opened one, this one be 0, and this one be 1 at the period, end of period. So since I only have data in 93, 97, 2000, I'll say that households only make decisions at these time points. So then I can estimate my equation. So here is the main equation or main relationship I'm interested in. So I want to see what's the effect of having self-employment in 1997 on household outcomes in 2000. And also I want to control for observed household characteristics in 2000. And the household outcomes in 2000 may also depend on unobserved characteristics, which is embodied in Z. And tau here, tau 2000, represents an average effect of the crisis on household outcomes during the crisis. And epsilon is the Merriman error. So for observed variables, I control for education, age, and gender composition of the household. So these are here because they will affect the returns to households in either sectors. Also, I control for the value of total non-business asset for the household because the value of non-business asset will affect their budget constraint when they make decisions. In terms of unobserved household characteristics, I think they will include factors that will affect returns to them in both sectors. For example, entrepreneurial ability, we don't observe it, but it will affect households' return in the self-employed sector greatly. And then, as I mentioned before, tau is the average effect of the crisis. So in terms of outcomes, as I mentioned, I want to look at consumption and the labor supply. So for consumption, I only have one measure, which is household per capita consumption, monthly real per capita consumption. So this will include all kinds of consumption, including education, health, and durables. And in terms of labor supply, I have more measures. So I have percentage of adult members older than 15 in the household who report that they were working in the last week. Also have percentage of adult members who report they were working in the last year. So the time period is different. Also have total hours worked by all adult members in the household in a normal week. So the answer was your hours in a normal week. I add all the hours for different numbers. And for this estimation, I also control for province indicator variables. So this estimation will be subject to an endogeneity issue because according to the same, similar to the same equation before, whether you have a self-employed business in 1997 will depend on whether you have it in the previous decision period in 1993, observed household characteristics, and also unobserved household characteristics. So because this SE 1997 depend on Z, the unobserved one, and also in the one I'm interested in, the Y 2000 outcomes in 2000 also depend on Z. But I want to look at the relationship between SE 1997 and 2000. So if there is an endogeneity issue, because both of these variables depend on unobserved variable. So to deal with this endogeneity issue, I use the difference in difference estimation. So how I conduct the difference in difference, I use two kinds of households. So for both groups of households, they did not have self-employment in 1993, but one group had self-employment in 1997, and the other group still did not have self-employment in 1997. So here's how the difference in difference will work. So for both groups in 2000, we still have the same equation. So outcomes in 2000 depends on SE 1997 and also depends on the variables. Here's the crisis effect and Merriman error. And then for both groups in 1997, the outcomes in 1997 will depend on observed variables in 1997 and also on unobserved variables. But this SE 1997 doesn't appear because none of them have self-employment in 1993. So the SE 1993 is not here. And then when we take difference between equation 3 and 5, we arrive at equation, 3 and 4, we arrive at equation 5. So the change in outcomes between 97 and 2000 will depend on, when it's different, will depend on whether they have self-employment in 1997, the change in characteristics between these 2 years, and the unobserved variable is difference out, so it no longer appear here, and the crisis effect is still here, and also depend on the change in environment error. So now, since we no longer have unobserved variable, we can estimate this equation accurately, so there's no bias when we estimate equation 5. So the main assumption for the difference in difference strategy is that for the unobserved variables, it doesn't change over time. So that's why for these two equations, the z appears to be the same. And then we can difference out the unobserved part and have all observed parts in the equations. So to kind of have a test of this assumption, I estimate the same equation for intact households. So for these kind of households, the members haven't changed from 93 to 2000. So if there's any unobserved things attached to the members, since the members haven't changed, then unobserved variables won't be changed. Other assumptions also have to be made for my estimation to work. So for example, our relationships need to be linear. There's no idiosyncratic shock, so in these equations, the shock is only embedded in the crisis shock, so there's no household level shock. And then household expectations of shocks won't change over time, so it won't appear differently in different equations. And also I assume that the shocks in the pre-crisis period is not correlated with shocks during crisis period, so it's independent over time. So based on these assumptions, I estimate the equation 5 on 3 different samples. The first sample is the full sample. The second one is households that were intact. I just talked about it. And then the third sample is households with hours information. So a lot of households actually don't have full information on hours. So when I want to include hours, it decreases the sample a lot. So that's why I do the same set of estimations just for this sample. And here's some descriptive statistics. So the control group is the group that did not have self-employment neither in 93 and nor in 97. The treatment group is the group that did not have self-employment in 93 but had self-employment in 97. So we can see in terms of level in 1997, these two groups are different. So by 1997, this group already have a self-employed business. This group doesn't. So they have different size. The education in the control group or no self-employed business group is higher. In terms of consumption, also it's higher for this group. In terms of working, this group works less than the group that has self-employment. And then if we look at the change during the crisis, we can see there's no difference between these. Sorry, if it's bold, it's significantly different. If it's not bold, they're not different. So in terms of change, the changing household size education is not significantly different. Also, the change in consumption is not different between these two groups, but the change in work is very different between these two groups. So for the control group that didn't have self-employment, there's a much bigger increase in work than for the treatment group that had self-employment. So this kind of shows the difference in difference results. So here is the results from the formal estimation. So all of these numbers is alpha. It's alpha 1. So it's the fact of having self-employment in 1997 on the change in on household outcomes, so consumption and labor supply during the crisis. So you can see in terms of consumption, the effect of having self-employment before the crisis on outcomes during the crisis is not significant. And then in terms of work, however, it's very significant. So if you have self-employment before the crisis, you would have say this one, you would have around 10% less of people working during the crisis. And same here is for intact households. And in terms of work in the last year, if you have self-employment, you would have 6% less people working during the crisis, and you would have 10% less working if it's only for intact households. For households with hours, the effect of self-employment on work is still negative, but smaller. And here we can see that in terms of hours worked in a normal week, if you have self-employment before the crisis, you would have around 13 hours less of work per week. So you can see that for the sample that have hours information, the effect of self-employment on work is the magnitude is smaller than the other samples. So why would this be? I think maybe one potential explanation is that people with hours information have more secure jobs. So no matter if they're self-employed or wage employment, they would be hit less than the crisis. So we would see a smaller effect for these households. And also, this results may actually show a secular trend of modern sector and the traditional sector converging. So, in another word, maybe the households with self-employed are becoming more like modern households, so they would decrease their work gradually over time. So I refute this explanation because both groups actually started as a modern family, so they did not have self-employment in 93, both of them. So there's no converging because they were already none of the self-employed sector in 93. And also another thing that we can see from the results is that there's an effect on labor, on work, but there's no effect on consumption. So I think this may be due to two facts. So maybe consumption has recovered more by 2000 than labor. So it takes the households longer to adjust labor allocations than consumption. So by 2000, since the crisis has recovered a little, so we may not see much effect on consumption because it has recovered. This is kind of backed up by the estimate of TAL, which is the average effect of the crisis on households in terms of consumption and the labor. So you can see the average effect of crisis on households in terms of consumption is negative but not significant. So meaning there is no change if we take this seriously. But the effect of crisis on households work is actually still significant and positive. So households on average has increased work a lot during the crisis by 2000. So it's kind of backing up this explanation. Also, consumption may be smoothed better than the work because for poor households, you cannot really decrease consumption much, but you can always work more. So we will not see the change in consumption as well as much as in work. So to conclude, I have analyzed the insurance role of self-employed sector during the Asian financial crisis in urban Indonesia, and have found large insurance value of the self-employed sector in the sense that if they had self-employment before the crisis, they would have a much less increase in labor to maintain the same level of consumption. So for future work, I think I can also look at the effect of prior self-employment on other household outcomes. So not only consumption labor, I can also look at education and health, whether that also improves household welfare during the crisis. And also it's possible to use other measures of self-employment. So far I only use the indicator variable, but you can use a number of people employed in a self-employed business. You can use assets in a self-employed business, so it may be a more accurate measure of self-employment. And so far I've only looked at insurance role of self-employment during a crisis, so during aggregate shocks. But the insurance story would work more if it still has insurance value during non-crisis normal times. So I think it's an interesting future direction. Also, I think the option to to be able to switch into self-employment if the wage sector is hit hard. It's also a form of insurance. So you always have this backup option, and it's also insurance. So